we're back again with Ask an Archaeologist. First, we have Dr. Kenneth Brown back again to talk to us about the Rail Yards project from 2017. However, there were a couple of questions our guest wanted to know. What is TRC? What is this company that you work for?
TRC, we've been around since actually the early 60s or whatever. The branch of the companies, that, like so many big companies today, is a conglomerate. I work with the TRC Environmental Corporation, which is a subdivision of we have engineers in my office here in Albuquerque. The environmental division includes archaeologists and biologists, NEPA, wetland biologists. We also have on the other side of the building engineers that design power substations and distribution power lines. We have a whole division of the company, and we have over 120 offices nationwide from coast to coast and employ a little over 5,000 people. And all the way from the environmental end of it to engineers, we design power plants. We do a lot of renewable energy work with both solar and wind. We do hazmat. In fact, we've had a crew down in the South Valley in the railroad area there, south of those big fuel tanks on Broadway. That's a national hazmat site because they used to, back at the turn of the century, when I say turn of the century, I'm talking in 1900, not 2000, they used to creosote railroad ties there, and so the ground is contaminated with creosote, and it's gradually spreading through the groundwater there in the South Valley. And so our company monitors that. We've been down there for about 10 years, and we'll probably be there another 10 or 20 years monitoring and trying to control the contamination of the groundwater from the creosote that was put there 120 years ago by the railroad. And that's being funded by the Atchison, Topeka, or actually by BNSF, are responsible for that. So, but anyway, our company does all kinds of infrastructure development. We do stuff with highways, a lot of energy related, like they say. And our office here in Albuquerque's been here about 35 years, maybe going on 40 years. So anyway, anything that concerns infrastructure, we do the permitting, environmental permitting, and assist clients in getting their permits with the different federal and state and local municipal agencies and governments and tribes to get their projects built.
Awesome. Actually, a little fun fact is Ken tried to hire me several times for some of those projects as a professional archaeologist, but I ended up at the state. It worked well for me too. So the second question is, what is your position at TRC?
At the office here, I'm the Cultural Resources Program Manager. And so I'm in charge of all cultural resources work. That's anything related to prehistoric, historic, architectural, anything concerning historic or cultural resources. I'm the principal investigator and manager of that. I have principal investigators under me and project managers. So we divvy up projects, assign different clients and projects to different permitted supervisor personnel. Are you going to ask what TRC stands for?
That's another question, because I don't even know that. I think I asked you this when I did an interview on the phone with you, and I still don't remember.
Yeah, actually, most TRC employees don't know what it stands for either. Most people don't. We tell our clients it means the right choice, to hire us to do their work. Going back to the 1960s, it started out with, I think, Travelers Insurance Company owned us. They started us. And it was Travelers, I think TRC was Travelers Research Corporation, something like that. And then Travelers Insurance sold us off, and anyway, the rest is history. So I've been told that the company started back in the late 1950s by a couple of it was Ivy League graduates, either Harvard or Princeton or Yale. They were into cloud seeding to turn the deserts of the world into gardens of Eden. And so they were into cloud seeding. And so that's how the company supposedly actually started, with these two Ivy League grads that thought, hey, we'll get into cloud seeding. Obviously, that didn't pan out too well, but they expanded the company into engineering and environmental permitting. So.
Yep, and here you guys are.
Right. And we're not doing much cloud seeding anymore.
No, but you still do environmental work. So.
Right. Thank you for joining us today. I'm glad to be back. It's been a fast 3 weeks or whatever when I was here last time. I had mentioned last time I was here that that TRC had done some work for the city of Albuquerque down in the railroad yards down just east of, or kind of southeast of downtown. First off, I don't know how much or how familiar people are with the history of the railroad in New Mexico, but just to give you a little quick background, it started out as a couple of different railroad lines that were initially started in Kansas, and they eventually merged and became the ATS, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. And there was a rush after the Civil War, particularly in the 1870s, the West was opening up. The railroads were really greatly expanding in commerce and so forth. The AT and SF was trying to get into New Mexico coming down out of Kansas, and there was actually a race between several different railroads. And over Raton Pass, there was a speed contest, so to speak. Whoever could get over Raton Pass the first with laid track got permitted, or I should say licensed by the state of New Mexico to enter New Mexico to continue building their line. And so if you, just a little bit of side note here, I encourage you to look up, there's a fair amount of literature on the race between the different railroad lines crossing Raton Pass to get into New Mexico. And the ATSF actually had crews working overnight throughout the entire night to cross the pass to beat their competition. Once they got across the pass, they headed south down Wagon Mound, heading towards Santa Fe. Got to Santa Fe, and essentially because of some grade issues, too steep of grades, Santa Fe became a spur line, just like it is today. The railroad goes through Lamy, and from Lamy it goes over to the Rio Grande Valley. And there they are saying it's going to build, of course, all the way down the Rio Grande to El Paso eventually. But they wanted to keep going west. And so they needed to be able to cross the Rio Grande. And so the ATSF sent realty agents ahead of the construction, of course, to acquire land. And for you folks that live in Bernalillo, in the town of Bernalillo, Sandoval County, the railroad agents arrived in 1878 to acquire property for a major railroad turntable and maintenance buildings and so forth. And they picked originally the town of Bernalillo. And so they sent their agents there, and there was the town elders there had heard that or I should say leaders, had heard that the railroad was coming. So they prepared to meet with them, and the railroad agents came into Bernalillo, and there was a Jose Perea. He and his family pretty much had a monopoly on the mercantile and transportation business, wagons and so forth, transferring goods. And so they met with the railroad agents, and for reasons unknown, Perea and his brother offered to sell their property for $425 an acre to the railroad, and the going price of land at that time was $2 to $3 an acre. And so the railroad agents, according to the historic records, spent only about 45 minutes there and headed south to Albuquerque. Although the ATSF bypassed the town of Bernalillo as a hub for the transcontinental railroad that they're trying to get out to California, there was no guarantee originally that the railroad hub would be built in Albuquerque. And the reason for that is the best crossing of the Rio Grande was about 12 miles south of Albuquerque on Isleta Pueblo land. So anyway, the agents came to Albuquerque in 1878, and the railroad agents met with the Albuquerque town leaders in June of 1879. The Albuquerque folks made a very big push to get the railroad to come there. They donated land, they sold it cheap. The railroad agents said, hey, we're going to put the hub in Albuquerque. So you can thank Jose Perea and his family. Otherwise, in 1878, Bernalillo would have been the railroad hub, and Albuquerque would have been like Bernalillo is today, just kind of a metropolis area as a sideshow to Bernalillo, which would have been the major railroad hub. So just one of those little quirks of history, people being a little greedy, and how it alters history for, add on. Anyway, the ATSF came in. They acquired land about a mile and a half or so east of Old Town. Remember, at this time, Albuquerque, there was no, where downtown Albuquerque today, it's called New Town. Old Town is the old plaza area, and that was Albuquerque back in 1878. And the land that the railroad acquired for their hub center was a mile and a half or so to the east. And as it turns out, some of that was swampland, but there was a little Hispanic community out there called Burales. So this is a map, 1898 town map. The railroad acquired the property in 1879, and they started construction in 1880 in what is now where those railroad yards are. And this is an 1898 map showing, you see this, just wanted to show where it is in relation to the main part of town. I've got some older maps here. This is an aerial view of the railroad yards today to the left. And you can see the overhaul buildings, the maintenance yards, and down here is the turntable that's there today. Just a little history. The city of Albuquerque is wanting to do something with this facility. Those buildings are sitting there vacant, and they do have movie studios. They've been using this a lot for movies, backdrops, but the buildings are empty. The building to the top right here over near the tracks, I think that's the one that they use for farmers market and some of their other things, activities down there. The map on the right is a topo map, just showing the railroad yards in relation to the rest of Albuquerque, and you can see where the river is. The map on the left, it's an 1883 plat map of Albuquerque. Here's Old Town. Right over here where my little arrow is, that's Old Town. New Town is right here, and the railroad yards that were being built at this time in the early 1880s is right there. And that's where the community of Burales, a little Hispanic community of Burales, was. Some of that was swampland. They had to actually drain it before they could build on it. And the map on the right is a later plat map, 1915. It shows you how Albuquerque, the new town, what became New Town versus Old Town. Old Town's the old plaza area today. New Town is now what we consider downtown Albuquerque. They had to build a road from Old Town to New Town. They called it Railroad Avenue. Well, today that's Central Avenue. So the city of Albuquerque is wanting to do something with these buildings, and the railroad yards is about 20 acres. And the entire yards are on the National Register of Historic Places. They're protected. And so before anything can be done, any major alterations or whatever, the city wanted to find out if there was any evidence of the earliest railroad yards there. Because what you see today, most of that today was built during World War I, from about 1914 to 1920. And so the earliest railroad facilities, of course, were built in 1880, through up until they were replaced by what we see today. And so the city of Albuquerque hired TRC to find out if there was anything earlier that occurs below the parking lots and the buildings there today. We devised a plan to determine if there was anything under the parking lots. We used a backhoe trenching. Before that, though, before I get into what we were doing, though, I've got some bird's eye maps. And this is an 1886 bird's eye map of Albuquerque. And you can see Old Town back in the background, New Town up here in the front, and the railroad yards. And you can already see where the New Town of Albuquerque, it grew all that in just 6 years. That's how fast the city was expanding. This is an 1898 map, and again, the railroad yards and Albuquerque, and just this is how much was built. This is all New Town. Old Town is off the map here, the old plaza. All this was built in a matter of like 18 years. And if you look down here in the red area, that's the railroad yards. And I want to point out there you can see kind of a semicircular structure there. That is the roundhouse, and there would have been a turntable right in front of that. And this would have been the original roundhouse and turntable built in 1880 and 1881. This is a 1908 Sanborn insurance map of the same area. And if you notice, you can see there's a round structure there. This is 1908, and the other one was 1898. In the meantime, and we'll be talking about this in a few minutes, this is a different turntable and roundhouse than the original one built at the railroad yards. Because what was happening was the railroads, the locomotives were getting bigger and bigger. And when the railroad first came to Albuquerque, locomotives weighed about 70 tons, 60 to 70 tons in 1880. By 1900, they were over 100 tons. And by 1915, they were over 120 to 130 tons. And the locomotives kept getting bigger and bigger, and so they were having to upgrade their facilities to accommodate the larger locomotives. TRC, our plan was to look in 6 different areas of the railroad yards for subterranean early railroad architecture, whatever it could be, foundations, buried tracks, or whatever. This is an aerial map of the current railroad yards. And we have 6 areas that we looked at, and they're numbered 1 through 6. Area 1 is right here in the parking lot, north of the main repair building shops. Area 2 is just south of that, right near the north end of those maintenance shops. Area 3 is at the north end of the yards, under the pavement, under the asphalt. Area 4 is over to the kind of the northeast there, near the railroad tracks. And Area 5 is down here, just north of the turntable that's there today, and the former roundhouse, which you can see the imprints here. It was unfortunately it was demolished back in the 1960s, 1970s. So the roundhouse that was built during World War I no longer exists, other than its foundation. Area 5, and then Area 6 is right here, and it's between some of the big maintenance shop buildings. I'll go through each of these 6 areas of what we did and what we found subterranean. Before we did any digging whatsoever, we hired a firm out of Socorro that came in to do what we call remote sensing. And they did use 2 methods. They used metal detection, as shown here on the top on the left, and they used GPR. GPR is ground penetrating radar. And so I'm not going to say ground penetrating radar over and over. It's easier to just say GPR. So that's the acronym. What we did was set up a grid like you would on excavating a site, and they walked transects with these sensors, with the metal detector and also with the the GPR unit. And by walking these transects across the parking lots here, and then using the appropriate software, they were able to generate maps of what is buried. We might ask, well, how deep does the metal detector go? This metal detector goes about 10 feet deep with its detection, and the ground penetrating radar system, it depends upon how compact the ground is, and as you might suspect, we're out in a parking lot here, so the ground is fairly compacted. So its penetration of subsurface terrain was about three feet or 1 meter deep. The results, this is the north. Remember area 1 and 2 on that earlier map. This is area, actually this is our areas 1, 2, and 3, and 4 combined. The existing railroad tracks are right over in here on the east boundary. The buildings, the maintenance shops are right down here at the very bottom. So we're out in the parking lot area. There's a chain link fence. There's a little white gap between these areas here. That's the chain link fence. And so this is what the metal detection came up with. And the map on the right is a blow up of the lower left-hand corner of this map over here. This image here is the one, it's just a blow up of it. And what I want to point out is you see all these little long lines. Some of those are buried utility pipes, water pipes. These over here to the left, those are buried railroad tracks. They never pulled them, they just asphalted over them. And then also, if you look over here on the blow up, you see there's a curved, moon-shaped configuration of yellow, primarily yellow, right there. And the chain link fence is between it. And then, of course, these are buried railroad tracks coming in from top here into whatever this circular thing is. So that's what imagery looks like for metal detection. And it worked very well. We've got all kinds of buried pipes. We've got buried railroad tracks, and we have some kind of an architecture image right here. This is the north part, and that area, it would be our area 3 and 4. It's just a separate little image of what was the bigger map before. This is where the existing tracks are. You see there's a bunch of red images, detection here of metal, something buried there, and they're kind of rectangular, so it most likely some kind of architecture. On the right is the GPR responses. This doesn't look like Jurassic Park at all, does it? It doesn't give you bones or whatever, or actual imagery of buildings or whatever. What you're looking at, what the GPR does is it's like slicing through the ground, and you're getting a profile. As you see here, it says northing, and then it gives a depth. And you're looking for these little waves, anomalies. In this case, we have to the left here, it says ringing from surface metal right there. We have over to the right, this is what the buried railroad tracks are providing as far as GPR, that image there. Down here at the bottom, we have a lot of compacted ground. And then over here on the right, along this transect, we have a lot of buried historic rubble. I do not interpret these. This was interpreted by our remote sensing specialist. It'd be like if you go to your doctor and you get an x-ray, obviously you're not going to try to interpret your x-ray, and that's exactly this. The people that do this remote sensing are experts. They know how to interpret all the different anomalies that show up on these imageries. Back to our area 1. This is the chain link fence that runs on the parking lot. And you'll see we came in with a backhoe and started digging trenches to cross our anomalies that were showing up with the metal detection and the GPR, and to try to expose whatever the architecture was underground. And lo and behold, some of those linear objects turned out to be foundations, or we called them pilasters. And you see here, this is red sandstone. And red sandstone is what the railroad used to construct all of their earliest buildings at the railroad. In fact, if you go down there today, there is the only remaining red sandstone building on site is the old firehouse, and it's still there right off on the west edge of the parking lot at the north end of the railroad yard. It's a fairly tall, I think two-story red stone building that was originally built back in the 1880s. And so that's the kind of stone that was used, and that's what this is. These are pilasters or foundations to a buried structure that is under the parking lot. And it's buried about 40 to 50 centimeters below the asphalt and gravel out there in the North Railroad parking lot. This map here, you can see we ended up exposing 3 pilasters like that, and they're labeled here in green, pilasters 1, 2, and 3. I want to point out this long linear trench area here on the left. What these pilasters, this is an architectural drawing from a 1910 railroad architecture book. And if you look here, you can see, lo and behold, these little square footings. These are the pilasters in this architectural drawing. And between the pilasters, the railroad tracks would come in, and what we're looking at here is the remains of a roundhouse that used to be there. The tracks would come in between the pilasters into the roundhouse for maintenance and switching the trains, rotating and maintenance on the trains. And at the south part of the roundhouse, down here on this architectural drawing, down here would be the turntable, where they rotate the trains on the turntable. So this drawing here very accurately depicts exactly what we were finding in those pilasters. They're there. We only uncovered 3 of them, but there's undoubtedly many more there. This is a close-up of the drawings. Again, this is showing the track coming down, and the track is elevated, and that down in the bottom of it is a concrete pit. And if for those of us older folks, if you remember before there was hydraulic car lifts, I'm talking back in the 1950s, 1960s, you go to a garage, they would have a maintenance pit in the floor of the garage. And so the mechanic, would go into the floor of the garage, and you drive your car over the pit. Well, that's exactly what this is. These are pits, and the concrete lined pits with between the tracks. That's what we're finding up here. We were finding remains of a roundhouse with those pilasters and tracks. South, remember that semi-arced thing that we saw on our metal detector? That was shown right in here. You can see the fence line. This is an aerial. This is the north of the buildings. Building over here is where they have their flea market and so forth down there. This is all parking lot. Anyway, we dug a couple of trenches to try to catch what this rectangle or this circular anomaly was. And so we have this area in here that we trenched and we scraped, and to find out, to see what was buried. What I'll show here is, this is a picture of the original 1881 roundhouse, the first roundhouse built. They have not built the turntable yet. Right out here in the front is where the turntable was later built. And so this is what the structure we're looking at from those pilasters, and that circular thing that we're going to get to is the remains of a turntable. And this is a photo, 1900 photo, June the 8th of the original turntable that was built in 1881. And this is, I love this photo because whoever was driving this locomotive, the engineer, it must have been his worst day, because he ran the locomotive off the track and turned into their turntable pit. And so they're having to use 4 locomotives to pull this one locomotive, which weighs, I think it was 109 tons, out of the pit. And so anyhow, it's an interesting accident. Obviously, we didn't have OSHA back then. So accidents like this apparently happened. But anyway, I just wanted to show you this is what the roundhouse looked like. And this is the turntable pit of the original 1881. Those linear tracks that come in and through the roundhouse, this is, I just wanted to show, this is the concrete pit that the tracks would be right here. This would be one track. This would be another track on top of this concrete. And this is the pit that the workers would get down under into the belly of the locomotives. They drive the locomotives over these pits. We dug, and this is what we hit with our backhoe. And it's brick. And it has a curvilinear, we had, if you remember get back to this slide, we have two backhoe trenches, one here and one here. And we hit this brick in both of them. This brick turned out to be the remains of the 1903 turntable. As mentioned before, the locomotives are getting bigger. And in 1903, they built a larger turntable. The original turntable, built in 1880-81, had a diameter of about 50 feet. This turntable, built in 1903, was a 90-foot diameter turntable to accommodate the larger locomotives. And the reason we know it's 90 feet in diameter is we've got the curvature of it from two trenches, and if you work out the diameter and follow the arch around, it's 90 feet. So that 1903 turntable is still intact under the parking lot there at the railroad yards. And this is a top view of the bricks of that 1903 turntable. We exposed some of the rest of the arc of the turntable so we could get I said we were able to determine that it's got a 90-foot diameter. So that we know is the 1903, and it's intact. This is an aerial view, and that would be right north of these buildings, right over here to the left. That's where we're talking about. This is up at the top of our original map. This is an area 3. If you remember at one of the first slides I had, we had areas 1 through 4 at the north part. And this is an area 3. This is actually in area 3. We found some foundations, and no one knew that there was anything there. These do not show up on the bird's eye maps that I showed earlier in the presentation. And what we believe they are, based upon some railroad records, is this is probably where their coal bins were for the refueling the locomotives up the north end there. And so these are probably the foundations of their coal bins. And that would have been, this is off the map here, this area. What I want to talk about next is the south part, down where the current turntable is. I understand you're going to be doing a visit there. That's terrific. The turntable right here, it's still there. It's about 120 feet in diameter. It still operates. It's still operational. The roundhouse here that was built during World War I, unfortunately, all that's left there is the foundation. It's gone. Here there's a big smokestack, and over in here is the power plant. All this was built during World War I, but none of this is there today except for the turntable. This building down here, right here, if you go down there, I'm sure you'll probably be visiting what they call the Wheels Museum. So a real interesting museum. I encourage you to visit it. They've got very interesting stuff there. All these buildings here are still intact. They're still there. So I'm going to be talking about this area down right in here next. And I just want close up. You go down to do the visit. This is the remains of the roundhouse down there today that was built during World War I. And this would be very similar, or in fact, it's pretty much identical to the roundhouse that we found at the other end of the railroad yards I was talking about before, that with the pilasters. Well, instead of pilasters here, we have poured concrete, and we have the pits are still here that they could get underneath the locomotives, and we have the tracks running across these pits. And off to the right here is the turntable that's still there today. This would have all been a huge, this would have been that huge roundhouse. This is what the turntable that's there today. It's like, say, it's about 120 feet in diameter, and you see the turntable pit, and it still rotates. It's still operational, but they don't use it. But it could be used if they wanted to. You could take a spin on it, as they would say. This is the remote sensing metal detection of that area that I was showing you. And this area, the map on the left here, is the entire area that we did metal detection for. And this is where the roundhouse, the former roundhouse, was, this big white area. We knew that was a roundhouse, so there's no need to do metal detection there. What we did was search the paved or the parking lot area north of it. And this, you see that there's some anomalies showing up in here, and there's some buried pipes. These turned out to be water lines and buried utility lines over here that's paralleling the railroad tracks. We have this circular anomaly here. This is a blow up of this, the left map. This is a blow up of it. And you can see some rectangular foundations in here, some nice linear areas. And if you remember what I said before in that aerial photo, this is the area of the power station where the smokestack and the powerhouse was. In fact, there's right down here in this red area is a circular pad for the smokestack. It's still visible there today. And then there's some weird little anomalies showing up here at the top left of remote sensing metal detection. This is the GPR results of that area, a couple of the transects, and excuse me. And you see there's some compact ground and some kind of strange anomalies that we ended up doing some backhoe trenching for. But these, again, the GPR results are like looking at a profile of a trench. You're looking at a cross section. You're not looking at an aerial shot like the metal detection. It's a different, this is a vertical perspection, not a horizontal. So this is that south area, and we put in some trenches. This is the circular pad for the smokestack, the powerhouse that was has been demolished. These backhoe trenches here, all we found was a bunch of rubble. Apparently the powerhouse probably had a basement in it, and when they demolished it, they simply bulldozed everything down into it. So this is just full of material associated with the demolition of the powerhouse. This backhoe trench right here at the top left, the south end of it, the little green area there, we found evidence of a structure. And opening our backhoe trench about over a meter deep, we found a wooden tunnel. Actually, it's a conduit, and it's creosoted wood. It's just large enough for an average human person to crawl through it on your hands and knees. It's hollow, and it runs, we don't know how long it extends, but it runs east-west, north of the original, of the powerhouse. And there are some utility lines, old, when I say utility lines, pipes running through it. It's totally intact, perfectly preserved. It hasn't rotted any. And doing some research in the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe records, this is a conduit that was probably built in the 1920s, about 100 years ago. And when they converted, I don't know how many people know this, but they converted the coal-burning locomotives to diesel fuel back in the 1920s. And so it is easier to refuel and cleaner burning, and you don't have to, it wasn't near as dirty and dusty as coal. And so there was a conversion of the locomotives from coal burning to diesel fuel. And so this is believed related to running probably pipes for diesel pipe fuel lines and so forth from their tanks over toward the tracks to refuel the locomotives at that time. which is kind of neat. No one knew it was there, and it's perfectly preserved subterranean architecture. Finally, in Area 6, but I mentioned that we did some exploration. We came up with an anomaly with our metal detection between the large maintenance buildings. These are some tracks running down through here. Talking with the people at the Wheels Museum, they told us about an urban legend. It has it that, as you remember, I said that this was originally some swampland back in 1880, and so some of it had to be drained before they could build their railroad facilities. Well, urban legend has it that when they built these railroad shops during World War I, later on, up at the northeast corner of one of them, they started having some subsidence of the building. It was starting to sink. And so the urban legend is they took a couple of old dilapidated locomotives and dug holes at near the foundation and buried the locomotives to help shore up the foundation of the maintenance building. And so we couldn't resist. We had to check it out. And so this is the metal detection of that strip between the buildings. One of the maintenance buildings we were just looking at is right here at the north, where the tracks, the railroad tracks are. And the other building is right here at the south. You notice there's a couple of things here called urinals. Well, instead of having enclosed bathrooms, on the north side of that maintenance shop, there are some large metal urinals for the shop workers. And they show up on the metal detection, which I think is kind of neat. Over here to the left, you see this big red and yellow glob. There's something there that's buried in the ground that is one heck of a big chunk of steel or iron or whatever, metal. And so that's the location of our urban legend. So we started to dig a backhoe trench into this, and we had to stop because I got he was nice about it. The city fire marshal of Albuquerque called me up the morning we started trenching over here and said I was breaking the law that we were trenching a trench into their emergency fire lane into the railroad yard. And so we had to immediately stop our backhoe trenching and backfill since we were in violation of the fire code. So the gist of it is, it's still an urban legend. We know there's something big that's got a real large magnetic metal signature there at that corner of that building. And whether it's a locomotive or whatever, well, we don't know. Until the fire marshal allows someone to go in to do some digging, we'll probably never know. So just to sum up our explorations there, this is our shot back to at the beginning. What we did find was we found that wooden conduit that was totally unknown for the conversion to run pipes and other utilities, probably in the 1920s when they were converting the engines from coal to diesel fuel. In the north end here, where we started out, we found the 1903 90-foot diameter turntable, and from what we can determine, it's intact. It's in the parking lot here, and it undoubtedly goes underneath these maintenance buildings here. We found at the north area here some pilasters and buried pits, track pits for maintenance of former remains of a roundhouse that is associated with the 1903 turntable. And then up at the top here, it's not shown on this map, we found good evidence that probably were the early coal storage yards facilities were. So the end result of this is there is buried architectural remains down at the railroad yards in the historic district that date back to the earliest 1880s through prior to World War I, the 1903 construction of a larger turntable and roundhouse and so forth. Those items are intact. And so one of the results of our explorations was that the New Mexico SHPO ended up having to update the National Register nomination form for the historic district, because at that, up until our results here, they did not know any of this earlier material existed. And so they had to update the National Register document to indicate that there is original and also a lot of circa 1900 railroad architecture intact, because the original nomination actually didn't start until the World War I material that's still standing. That is all I'll have to say. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
And this is Cheryl. What if you had happened on a pottery sherd or two, or God forbid, a bone? What would you have done?
Actually, we did find some bones, but they were chicken bones and probably someone's lunch remains from the railroad workers or whatever. If we had found human remains, we would have stopped excavation immediately. That's state law. We would not have, if we'd have found a single human bone, whether it was a tooth, a finger bone or a toe bone, where that spot of digging would have ceased immediately. Fortunately, we didn't find anything. And this is industrial archaeology, what we refer to as industrial archaeology. This is a big industrial site. We're talking railroads, lots of heavy machinery. And I say by the 19 teens and 20s, the locomotives were getting up to be huge, 120 tons, 130 tons. And so, in fact, I'll bring up, I don't know how familiar any of you are, there's the, I can't remember the organization, they're restoring the big locomotive in Albuquerque that used to be on the park there off the interstate. In fact, the locomotive is almost completely restored. It's taken them 25 years to do it, and about, I think, close to, was it 200,000 or 300,000 man hours of restoration, whatever. It's when they have an open house a couple of times a year, and you can find their website. I really encourage you to, if they have an open house, you can walk on the locomotive. It was powered by diesel fuel, so it doesn't have a coal car, but it has an oil car and a water car. The car that it pulls for diesel fuel also has water, because steam engines use that particular engine boiled 100 gallons a minute. That's how much water it dissipated. So they had to carry not just the diesel fuel, but thousands of gallons of water to power it, because they were dissipating it at 100 gallons a minute. So anyway, I always find it just amazing. We think of this technology 100, 120 years ago, and it's just how massive it is. Because that locomotive with its car weighs over 1 million pounds.
I have a question. I would like to find out where you obtained the photographs of the old roundhouse and that accident.
There's the reference there, Johnson and Donner, 1981, page 83. I can send the full reference to that. In fact, I can send you our entire references cited section for this report. You might find some of the other references that we used with the historic photos interesting. I don't want to repeat myself, but I say that the SHPO had to remodify or update the National Historic Register form for this National Historic District. The city of Albuquerque right now, they haven't done anything, but we did make some recommendations in our work, because we have that 1903 turntable pit that's pretty much intact, that red brick line. It's 90 feet in diameter. We recommended that you could expose it and put a kiosk in there explaining, what it is and so forth, and you could have kind of like a subterranean outdoor eating area with a nearby restaurant or something like that, cafeteria, and you could incorporate that pit into an outdoor subterranean, or exhibit or fountain or something. In the same way with some of the other foundations, those pilasters and so forth, several of those could be exposed, and just a small part of the 1903 roundhouse could be reconstructed, and you could make it kind of like a I don't know, covered patio area or whatever, with the original pilasters and tracks and stuff in there. Anyway, we threw those out as examples of historic recycling of some of this buried architecture. And of course, no one listened to us. So anyway, we threw the ideas out. That as an archaeologist, anthropologist, historic preservation, it's kind of like we don't want this, because it's a part of the historic district. Hopefully they don't go in and just blast it away or whatever for new foundations or whatever for taller new architecture, like they did the original railroad, the railroad station that they did back in 1970, which was the largest adobe building in the Southwest. Unfortunately, it got destroyed. Anyhow, because that was definitely a historic landmark.
Ken, was that the Alvarado Hotel?
Yes, the Alvarado, right. The railroad, the hotel and railroad yard, station. Like I say, that was built in right when all this was being built. And you have the Harvey house, the Harvey restaurant, that whole connection there with the Harvey girls and restaurant and all that. And the hotel is the largest of them all in the Southwest, the Alvarado. I say it was the largest adobe building in the Southwest, so or anywhere as far as I know. But the city saw better, I guess. The present Alvarado or the present rail yard or train station just doesn't quite have the air of the original 1880,
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Speaking
Sure.
of the city, I know that they are looking at putting a bike trail between the university and the biopark or the river. And of course, and that would be on Silver as a continuation of that part of Silver near the university, and have it just go straight down to the river, except that in the middle is the rail yards.
Right,
So,
and I was going to say Silver Street, if you extended it across, it would go right through the railroad.
Right. And so I think they are thinking about, running the bike trail north to Central to have it cross there and then back down on the other side. But I was wondering if you had heard anything about this?
No, I have not. You brought up Silver, just in connection with this. TRC, one of the first projects I was involved with when I started working at TRC about 12 years ago, was on 2nd and Silver, which is just to the east of the railroad yards there.
Yeah.
And one of the things there's apartments there. It's low-income housing apartment complex, and there's a couple of them there in those city blocks. And before they built the apartments, they were big paid for paid parking for downtown or whatever. Before that, that was the earliest urban development associated with the railroad coming in. Around 2nd and Silver Street, that's the earliest part of what is now Newtown or whatever, downtown Albuquerque. And it's interesting what we found. I don't know how familiar you are with Sanborn insurance maps.
Sure.
And also city directories. City directories had, the names of businesses and their addresses and stuff for every business and house in the city. Albuquerque's, you can go to the library and they still actually have most of the hardbound ones that go back to the 1880s. We researched those, and also the Sanborn insurance maps are a wealth of information. And interestingly, around Silver and 2nd Street, the earliest residents were some of these were the Irish and Chinese immigrants associated with the railroad. Number of Chinese laundries. And eventually That was in the 1880s, 1890s. Eventually, turn of the century, you had the Domenicis, like the Domenici family, Pete Domenici, former Senator Pete Domenici. His family ancestors came over around 1900 or whatever, and they settled in that area, and they essentially kind of pushed out the Chinese and Irish, and that became an Italian and French area. And so you have these different ethnic groups that kind of came in and inhabited different parts of downtown Albuquerque associated with the railroad through its history. And finally, you get into the 1950s, and a lot of that area was demolished because the buildings were getting dilapidated and were turned into big parking lots, paid parking lots for downtown.
Can I ask another quick question? Supposedly there was company housing at somewhere on the rail yard property or near there for the foremen and engineers and other people that they thought should be available 24 hours a day for presumably accidents and this kind of thing. So I'm wondering if any of those areas that you're talking about were where the company housing was. And also the Bowery, which was owned by a prominent Italian family, not the Domenicis, was on Broadway or Central and First Street, sort of, and there was a number of bars along there which did not enjoy good reputations, but they were certainly moneymakers. So, but anyway, do you know anything about the company housing?
Not really. We didn't find any evidence of it in the rail yards. I suspect it would be like around second and silver, first and silver, first and gold, first and all those mineral named streets over there. In that area, that's probably where it was. The first buildings built were wood framed, and then they were, because of the potential fires and so forth, by the 1890s, a lot of the construction had switched to brick. So more permanent, less fire hazard and so forth. Railroad yards were notorious for fires. You know, you got locomotives and cinders were blowing out of the smokestacks and everything else, and the power plants and everything. So they were a fire hazard area. You mentioned up there at First and I don't remember the other street you mentioned. There's the former, I don't know if you know Matt Schmader. He used to be the city archaeologist and head of the open space. He retired a couple of years ago. He wrote a excellent little paper called Hell's Half Acre, and it's available online, I believe. And it has to do with, let's just say, prostitution in Albuquerque at the time of the early railroad. That's there's a couple of city blocks up there that were notorious and known for their activities and stuff, and he called it Hell's Half Acre.
I went to high school at St. Mary's, which is downtown.
Right,
and,
I know where St. Mary's is.
So after school, a bunch of high school kids wandering around, and so we knew where not to go more than anything.
This is a little, I have not seen this myself. This is getting off track a little bit, but there is a brick-lined acequia irrigation ditch running north-south through downtown Albuquerque. It runs under some of the bank buildings and hotels down there. It's pretty much intact. You can walk, it's so big you can walk through the thing. And I have not walked through it, but I've known some colleagues, other archaeologists, that have seen it and walked in it.
Oh my God.
It is intact, and from what we can determine, no one knows when it was built. But it is an underground acequia. It's a big one, probably built, it might have, goes back maybe even to before the railroad, might be even Hispanic, Spanish colonial. I'm trying to think, it's probably over there around 3rd Street something like that, over in that area.
Mr. Brown, this is a question I was asking. Do the Sanborn maps go back to when that housing was? Maybe Alice could find stuff on the Sanborn map.
You bet. The Sanborn backs go clear back to the 1880s.
Yeah.
So many of them are available on the internet, but if you really want to get to see I like the paper ones myself.
Me too.
They're big. You can go to. Are you familiar with MAGIC, the Map and Geographic Information Library at the UNM, and also the City Library should have them. But I always usually go to the UNM map library. It's called MAGIC, and they have the complete paper set of all of the Sanborn maps for Albuquerque, and they start in the 1880s and they go clear up into the 1960s or whatever. And they're a wealth of information. They're hand color coded. You can tell which buildings were adobe, which ones were concrete block. They color coded them by the type of architecture they were. And many of them are labeled as what they are. They're like Chinese laundry or mercantile or whatever. They're a wealth of information.
Good to know. Thank you.